You need to get out of the road and out of this rain. Get in the car, please.
Darius Cole spoke at 10:34 p.m. on a Tuesday evening as he slammed brakes on his pickup truck to avoid hitting young woman standing motionless in middle of rural highway, her soaked figure illuminated by headlights that revealed she was wearing thin dress completely inappropriate for weather, no shoes, no jacket, and expression of such profound confusion that Darius's immediate assessment was either severe mental health crisis or drug-induced disorientation that required emergency intervention, regardless of whether she wanted help. At 38, Darius Cole possessed the kind of automatic crisis response that characterized former detectives whose 8 years in law enforcement had trained pattern recognition that civilian employment as construction foreman couldn't fully suppress. Seeing woman in middle of road during storm triggered immediate evaluation of threat assessment, vulnerability factors, and risk indicators that suggested this wasn't simple motorist with car trouble, but rather person in active danger from circumstances his detective training wanted to investigate, despite having left police work 8 years ago after professional failure that still haunted him during moments like this. The woman didn't respond to his shout, didn't move towards safety, just continued standing in road, staring at headlights with blank expression that suggested she either couldn't process his command or was too disoriented to execute self-preservation that survival instinct should have made automatic, forcing Darius to exit truck and physically guide her to passenger seat, where hypothermia symptoms, shivering, pale skin, confused responses became immediately apparent once interior light revealed. Extent of her exposure to elements. "Can you tell me your name?" Darius asked once he'd gotten her inside truck and activated heater, his question using calm professional tone that 8 years of police work had developed for dealing with trauma victims whose cooperation required establishing trust rather than demanding compliance. "You're safe now. I'm not going to hurt you, but I need to know who you are so I can help you." At approximately 23 years old, based on appearance, the woman possessed the kind of profound disorientation that characterized severe trauma victims or people experiencing dissociative episodes. Her eyes were unfocused, her breathing shallow, and her failure to respond to direct questions suggested either inability or unwillingness to provide basic identifying information that normal person in crisis would typically offer to stranger providing assistance. "I don't know," she finally whispered after 47 seconds of silence, her voice barely audible over rain pounding on truck roof. "I don't know my name. I don't know where I am. I don't know how I got here." Mati, the response was both concerning and familiar. Darius had encountered amnesia cases during detective work, usually involving head trauma or psychological shock that temporarily disrupted memory formation, but complete identity loss suggested either severe physical injury or such profound psychological trauma that brain had defensively suppressed all biographical information to protect consciousness from memories too painful to process. "Okay, that's okay," Darius replied, maintaining calm demeanor while mentally cataloging evidence that suggested this woman needed medical evaluation and police involvement regardless of whether she could provide identifying information. "Can you tell me if you're hurt? Are you in pain anywhere? Did someone hurt you?" "I can't go to hospital," the woman said suddenly, her vague disorientation sharpening into focused panic at suggestion of medical facility. "Please don't take me to hospital. They'll find me there. I don't remember why, but I know hospitals aren't safe. Please." The specific fear about hospitals, despite claiming complete memory loss, was a significant red flag that suggested partial memory retention focused on threat assessment rather than biographical details, creating pattern consistent with trauma victims whose brains prioritize survival information over personal identity when both couldn't be simultaneously maintained during crisis. "Who will find you at hospital?" Darius pressed, his detective instincts activating despite 8 years away from investigative work. "Are you running from someone?" "Are you in danger?" "I don't know," she replied, tears mixing with rainwater still dripping from her soaked hair. "I can't remember, but I feel it. Hospitals mean danger. Being found means something terrible, and I'd rather die out here in rain than go somewhere they can find me." For 37 seconds, Darius processed options, while woman shivered beside him and rain continued making visibility nearly zero. Taking her to hospital was proper protocol for hypothermia and potential head trauma that amnesia suggested. But her terror about medical facilities, combined with defensive wounds he could now see on her wrists, suggested she might be fleeing domestic violence or trafficking situation where hospital intake procedures could alert perpetrators through systems that vulnerable people learned weren't always protective. "All right, I'm not taking you to hospital tonight," Darius decided, his choice violating proper procedure, but responding to detective instinct that suggested this woman's fear was based on legitimate threat rather than paranoid delusion. "I'm taking you to my house where you can get warm and dry, and tomorrow we'll figure out who you are and what help you actually need. But you need to understand, I have 12-year-old son at home. And if you're dangerous, or if this is some kind of setup, you picked wrong person to trust." "I'm not dangerous," she whispered. "I don't think I am. I don't remember being dangerous." The drive to Darius's modest rental house took 17 minutes through storm that made rural roads nearly impassable, during which woman provided no additional information beyond repeating that hospitals weren't safe and that someone was looking for her, though she couldn't remember who or why, creating mystery that every instinct Darius possessed wanted to investigate, despite knowing that involvement with unknown trauma victim violated every boundary he'd established when leaving police. Work. His son Eli was staying overnight with Darius's mother, Tuesday night arrangement that had become routine after divorce had created shared custody schedule, which meant house was empty when they arrived at 11:14 p.m., eliminating immediate complication of explaining to 12-year-old why father had brought home mysterious soaking wet woman with amnesia and defensive wounds. "Showers through that door, clean towels in cabinet, and I'll find you some clothes that might fit," Darius said once they were inside, his tone professional, despite growing concern about situation he'd voluntarily entered. "Take as long as you need to get warm. I'm going to make tea and figure out what to do next." "A deal." While woman showered, Darius photographed her original clothing. Thin dress that looked institutional, like hospital gown or facility uniform, and documented visible injuries that included healed bruises on upper arms consistent with restraint marks, partially healed cut on her temple, suggesting head injury within past 2 weeks. And concerning pattern of scars on her forearms that appeared old and deliberate, raising questions about long-term abuse or self-harm history that complete memory loss might be protecting her from confronting. His detective instinct screamed that he should photograph her face and run it through missing persons databases immediately, but doing so would create digital trail that might alert whoever she was fleeing, if his suspicion about her being tracked was accurate, forcing choice between proper investigative procedure and protecting vulnerable person whose fear might be justified, even if she couldn't remember why. "Thank you," the woman said 47 minutes later, as she emerged from bathroom wearing Darius's ex-wife's old sweatpants and t-shirt that he'd kept in back of closet. Her appearance transformed from hypothermic trauma victim to exhausted young woman whose face, now clean and no longer contorted with cold, revealed features that seemed oddly familiar in way Darius couldn't quite place. "I don't know why you helped me when you didn't have to, but thank you." "I helped you because leaving someone in middle of road during storm isn't option regardless of circumstances," Darius replied, handing her mug of tea. "Now we need to figure out who you are, because complete amnesia isn't a sustainable situation. You need medical evaluation. You probably need police involvement, and you definitely need proper help that I'm not qualified to provide despite best intentions." "Please don't call police tonight," she begged, panic returning. "I know you think you should, but something about police feels wrong too. Not as wrong as hospitals, but wrong enough that I'm asking you to wait until morning before deciding. Give me one night to see if memories come back before you make me face whatever I'm running from. Some discoveries about people in crisis emerge when strangers in trouble appear on dark roads during storms. And sometimes doing right thing means violating proper procedure, when vulnerable people's fear suggests that systems designed to protect them might actually expose them to dangers that amnesia is merciful enough to temporarily conceal. Before we continue, I need you to understand something. If you felt Darius's choice to help a stranger, if you understood why she feared hospitals, if you've ever had to decide between following rules and following your instincts, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that like button if that moment when she said, "I don't know my name," gave you chills. Comment below, what time is it? Where are you watching from? Would you have stopped for someone in the road? Would you have taken her to the hospital or respected her fear? Have you ever helped a stranger who couldn't explain why they needed help? Because in part 2, we're going to see what happens when Eli comes home and meets Jane. We're going to discover what Darius finds when he searches missing persons databases. And we're going to learn why this young woman looks hauntingly familiar to a case that destroyed Darius's detective career 20 years ago. A construction worker with detective instincts, a woman with no past, one rainy night that changes everything. Don't go anywhere. Part 2 starts right now. The morning after Darius Cole had brought mysterious amnesiac woman home from highway, he woke at 6:47 a.m. to find her sitting at his kitchen table, staring at coffee mug he'd left out the night before, her expression suggesting she'd been awake for hours, processing fragments of memory that sleep hadn't restored, creating scene where construction worker who'd intended to call police once daylight arrived now faced actual human being whose vulnerability made proper procedure seem crueler than continued protection despite growing complications. "Did you sleep at all?" Darius asked as he entered kitchen still wearing worn t-shirt and sweatpants, his question both caring and strategic, because sleep deprivation could explain continued memory loss that morning's rest should have partially resolved if amnesia was temporary rather than trauma-induced permanent condition. At approximately 23 years old, based on daylight assessment, the woman possessed features that Darius's detective training kept insisting he recognized, despite inability to place her face in any specific context. Something about her eyes and facial structure triggered familiarity that 8 years away from investigative work made impossible to pursue through official channels without involving authorities she'd begged him to avoid. "I slept for maybe 2 hours, she replied, her voice carrying exhaustion that went beyond single sleepless night to suggest chronic fatigue from whatever circumstances had put her on that highway. "I keep having dreams that feel like memories, but they don't make sense. White rooms, medical equipment, someone calling me by name I can't quite hear, and overwhelming fear that if I remember too much, something terrible will happen." "No, what name do they call you in the dreams?" Darius pressed, recognizing that dream content often contained suppressed memories that conscious mind couldn't access directly. "It starts with S, I think," she said uncertainly. "Sarah? Sophie? Something that feels almost right but not quite accurate, like hearing your name pronounced wrong but recognizing it's meant for you." Bah. At 38, Darius possessed emerging conviction that this woman's amnesia wasn't random medical event, but rather psychological protection from trauma so severe that remembering might be genuinely dangerous to her mental stability, creating ethical dilemma where his responsibility to involve proper authorities conflicted with his protective instinct toward vulnerable person whose fear might be justified warning rather than paranoid delusion. "I need to show you something," Darius said, making decision that would either help identify her or confirm his growing suspicion that her case connected to something larger than simple missing person. I'm going to search missing persons databases with your description, and I want you to look at results with me to see if anything triggers recognition. But I need your permission first, because once we know who you are, we can't unknow it, and there might be reasons your mind is protecting you from that information. What if I don't want to know? She asked, articulating fear that amnesia represented mercy rather than affliction. What if remembering is worse than staying lost? Then we'll deal with that together, Darius replied, using tone that combined professional objectivity with personal compassion. But living without identity isn't sustainable. You need name, history, resources that require knowing who you are, even if that knowledge includes painful truths. As Darius opened his laptop and accessed missing persons databases he technically no longer had authorization to search, but whose login credentials from detective days still worked through administrative oversight that 8 years hadn't corrected, the woman sat beside him with visible anxiety about discoveries that searches might produce. Female, early 20s, approximately 5'6", brown hair, green eyes, visible scarring on forearms, Darius narrated as he entered search parameters, his methodology automatic despite years away from investigative work. Limiting to cases filed within past 2 years initially, then expanding if nothing matches. The first search returned 47 results that didn't match. Wrong ages, wrong physical descriptions, cases that clearly weren't related to woman sitting beside him whose distinctive features should have made identification straightforward if she'd been reported missing recently. Nothing in past 2 years, Darius reported. Expanding to 5 years. Still nothing definitive. Several partial matches, but none that triggered recognition from woman whose amnesia apparently extended to inability to confirm or deny whether photographs of missing persons were her own face, suggesting either profound psychological dissociation or memory loss so complete that even self-recognition was compromised. "Let's try different approach," Darius said, switching tactics. "You mentioned dreams about medical facilities. I'm going to search for missing persons connected to hospitals, psychiatric facilities, or medical institutions where someone your age might have been patient or resident." This search returned 12 results, but 9th entry made Darius's hands freeze on keyboard as he processed what his detective instinct had been trying to tell him since first seeing her face in headlights. The woman sitting beside him looked exactly like age-progressed photograph for Sophia Whitmore, daughter of tech billionaire Richard Whitmore, who'd been kidnapped at age 3 from San Francisco Park in 2002, and whose case had been highest-profile missing child investigation in California. History before going cold after 6 months of intensive searching produced no leads, no suspects, and no body. "Oh my God," Darius whispered, pulling up full case file that included original disappearance photos, age progression images created at 5-year intervals, and detailed documentation about investigation that had consumed hundreds of law enforcement resources before being officially designated cold case in 2008. "I know who you are." "Who am I?" she asked, leaning forward to see screen where her own face, younger, happier, untraumatized, stared back from 23-year-old photograph showing toddler with distinctive green eyes and small birthmark below left ear that matched mark that Darius could now see on woman beside him. "Your name is Sophia Whitmore," Darius said slowly, his mind racing through implications. "You were kidnapped at age 3 in 2002 from San Francisco. Your father, Richard Whitmore, is tech billionaire who spent 23 years and estimated $400 million searching for you. Your disappearance was national news, and according to these files, you've been missing for so long that most people assumed you were dead." The revelation hit woman with physical impact. She gasped, hands flying to her face as if checking whether identity Darius had named matched self-image that amnesia had erased. her reaction suggesting that on some subconscious level his identification resonated, even though conscious memory couldn't confirm or deny whether Sophia Whitmore was name that belonged to her. "I'm someone's daughter," she whispered. "I have family who's been looking for me." "You have father who never stopped searching," Darius confirmed, pulling up recent news article from 3 months ago showing Richard Whitmore at press conference marking 23rd anniversary of Sophia's disappearance, his aged face displaying grief that 2 decades hadn't diminished. He holds annual press conference, maintains active investigation, offers $50 million reward for information leading to your recovery. He's never given up hope that you're alive somewhere. Meanwhile, 12-year-old Eli Cole was experiencing his own crisis as he arrived home unexpectedly at 8:23 a.m. after spending night at grandmother's house. Tuesday overnight stay had been cut short because grandmother had developed stomach bug, requiring Eli's return to father's care, creating situation where Darius's son would now meet mysterious woman whose presence required explanation that single father hadn't prepared. "Dad, Grandma's sick, so she brought me home early," Eli announced as he walked through front door carrying overnight bag. "She said you'd need to—" He stopped abruptly, noticing woman sitting at kitchen table beside his father, who was staring at laptop screen showing missing person photographs. "Who's that?" "Eli, this is Jane," Darius said, using placeholder name because explaining that woman was recovered kidnapping victim from 2002 seemed inappropriate for 12-year-old before Darius had processed implications himself. "She was in trouble last night and I helped her. She's going to stay with us for a little while until we figure some things out." "Is she your girlfriend?" Eli asked with 12-year-old directness that made both adults simultaneously uncomfortable. "Because if she is, you should have told me you were dating someone instead of surprising me with random woman at breakfast." "She's not my girlfriend," Darius clarified quickly. "She's someone who needed help, and I'm providing temporary assistance until proper authorities can be contacted. That's all." "Does she know you found her by searching missing persons databases?" Eli continued, revealing that he'd been close enough to see laptop screen. "Because that seems like pretty serious situation if she's actually missing person and you're hiding her here instead of calling police like you're supposed to." "Nildi." At 12 years old, Eli possessed uncomfortable perceptiveness about his father's choices that came from spending 6 years watching single-parent navigate moral complications that divorce and single parenthood created, making him more aware than typical 12-year-old about gap between what adults should do and what they actually chose when circumstances made proper behavior conflict with protective instinct. "You're right that this is a complicated situation," Darius admitted, recognizing that lying to his son would teach worse lesson than honest explanation about difficult choices. Sophia was kidnapped as child 23 years ago, and she escaped from whoever took her, and she's terrified of hospitals and police for reasons she can't remember. I'm trying to figure out how to help her safely before involving authorities who might mean well, but might also put her in danger if systems aren't as protective as they should be." "So you're hiding kidnapping victim in our house?" Eli summarized with 12-year-old precision. "Dad, that's literally crime. Like actual crime that could get you arrested for obstruction or harboring or whatever they call it when you don't report serious stuff to police. Some moral choices require parents explaining to children that proper procedure sometimes conflicts with protecting vulnerable people, and that teaching compassion sometimes means modeling civil disobedience when systems designed to help actually expose people to dangers that procedural compliance would facilitate rather than prevent." 6 days after Darius Cole had identified Jane as Sophia Whitmore, and made deliberate choice not to immediately contact billionaire father or law enforcement, despite his son's accurate observation that harboring recovered kidnapping victim constituted multiple crimes. He found himself sitting across from his ex-wife Teresa at custody mediation appointment, where his recent choices about housing mysterious woman were about to create complications that threatened his shared custody arrangement. With Eli, whose welfare had been Darius's primary consideration when leaving detective work 8 years ago. "Darius, Eli told me you're currently housing woman you met 6 days ago under circumstances you haven't fully explained," Teresa said at 2:47 p.m. during mediation session that family court required quarterly to address custody modifications. "He said she appeared on highway, that you brought her home without involving authorities, and that you're protecting her from people she can't remember but is afraid of. This sounds like either incredible irresponsibility or concerning judgment that affects your fitness as primary caregiver during your custody weeks." At 38, Darius possessed careful awareness that his choices about Sophia had created exactly the kind of situation that Teresa would interpret as evidence that his detective instincts were overriding parental judgment, validating her long-standing concern that his inability to let go of investigative work made him an unreliable parent whose protective impulses extended inappropriately to strangers, when that protection should be reserved exclusively for their son. "Teresa, the woman's name is Sophia Whitmore. She's recovered kidnapping victim from 2002 case, and I'm providing temporary safe house while figuring out how to reunite her with father without exposing her to systems that her trauma suggests aren't safe," Darius explained, using factual summary that Teresa's legal background as paralegal would recognize contained multiple procedural violations. "I understand this looks irresponsible, but involving authorities immediately could endanger someone who's been captive for 23 years and who finally escaped circumstances we don't fully understand." "Darius, that's not your responsibility," Teresa replied with frustration that characterized her response to most of his choices since divorce. "You're construction foreman, not detective anymore. You left police work because your obsession with cases was affecting your mental health and our marriage. Now you're bringing that same obsession into our son's home by housing kidnapping victim instead of calling proper authorities who should handle this situation. I left detective work because I failed to save 5-year-old kidnapping victim whose death I still have nightmares about," Darius said quietly, articulating trauma he rarely discussed. "Maybe helping Sophia is about redemption for that failure, but that doesn't make it wrong choice when she's terrified of systems that should protect her, but which her instincts say will expose her to danger." At 37, Teresa possessed complicated understanding of Darius's motivations. She'd been married to him during the case that had destroyed his detective career, had watched him spiral into depression after child's death, had supported his decision to leave police work, but had ultimately divorced him when his inability to process trauma had made their marriage unsustainable. Despite still caring about man whose protective instincts she admired, even when they created complications. "What does Eli think about this situation?" Family court mediator Rebecca Santos asked, redirecting conversation toward child's welfare that custody mediation existed to protect. "Is he comfortable having trauma victim living in his home? Does he understand the potential dangers if whoever held Sophia captive attempts to recover her?" "Eli has been remarkably mature about situation," Darius replied, recognizing that his son's adjustment didn't eliminate legitimate concerns about his safety. "He's been helping Sophia feel comfortable. He understands why she needs protection, and he hasn't complained about disruption to his routine that her presence creates." "But Darius, that's concerning rather than reassuring," Santos said, articulating problem that Darius's answer had revealed. 12-year-old shouldn't be remarkably mature about living with kidnapping victim. He should be having age-appropriate concerns about his own safety that responsible parent would validate rather than praising him for adjusting to inappropriate situation that you created by bringing stranger into his home. Meanwhile, Sophia was experiencing her own crisis as fragments of memory began returning in increasingly disturbing patterns. Dreams about medical facility where she'd been held, man's voice calling her "my daughter," despite knowing that wasn't true, and overwhelming fear associated with needles and hospitals that suggested her captivity had involved some form of medical abuse or experimentation that complete memory recovery would force her to confront. "I remember needles," Sophia told Darius during conversation at 7:34 p.m. after he'd returned from custody mediation. "Lots of needles, and man in white coat saying procedures were necessary to keep me healthy, and feeling like something was wrong, but being too scared to resist because resisting made things worse. I think whoever took me was doctor or worked in medical field, because the facility I remember feels clinical rather than like someone's home." "But that would explain your terror about hospitals," Darius observed, his detective mind processing implications. "If your captor was medical professional who used clinical setting for captivity, then hospitals would represent danger rather than safety, because that's where trauma occurred. Have you remembered anything about how you escaped?" "I remember running," Sophia said, tears forming as fragmented memory surfaced. "Door was unlocked. First time in years, maybe ever. And I just ran without thinking, without taking anything, just desperate to get away. I don't know how long I ran or how I ended up on that highway where you found me, but I remember thinking that dying in storm was better than staying one more day in that place." As Sophia's memories revealed that her escape had been recent and possibly accidental rather than carefully planned, Darius recognized that whoever had held her captive for 23 years was likely actively searching for her and would eventually track her to his home through methods that his limited resources couldn't indefinitely prevent, creating danger for both Sophia and Eli that his protective instinct couldn't fully mitigate without proper law enforcement support. "We need to contact your father," Darius said, making decision he'd been avoiding. "Not police yet, but Richard Whitmore deserves to know you're alive, and he has resources to protect you that I can't provide. Keeping you hidden was meant to keep you safe, but it's putting my son at risk if your captor is looking for you, and I can't prioritize your safety over Eli's when that choice forces my 12-year-old to live with danger I created." "What if my father doesn't believe I'm really Sophia?" she asked, articulating fear that 23 years and complete memory loss made understandable. "What if he thinks I'm imposter trying to claim reward money? What if seeing me after all this time causes him pain that my presence doesn't justify because I can't remember being his daughter?" "Then we'll deal with that together," Darius replied. "But you deserve chance to reunite with family who's been searching for you, and Eli deserves to live in home that isn't hiding kidnapping victim from people who might come looking. I chose to help you and I don't regret that choice. But continuing to hide you means sacrificing my son's safety for your protection, and that sacrifice I can't make regardless of how much I want to keep you safe. Some sacrifices require acknowledging that protecting vulnerable people creates costs borne by other vulnerable people, and that parents must sometimes choose their own children's welfare over strangers' safety, when those competing responsibilities make simultaneous protection impossible, despite genuine desire to help everyone who needs assistance." 11 days after Darius Cole had contacted Richard Whitmore through intermediary to arrange meeting that would either reunite Billionaire with recovered daughter or expose Sophia as elaborate fraud, he stood in neutral hotel suite in downtown San Francisco, watching 70-year-old man, whose grief had aged him beyond his 62 years, approach young woman, whose face matched his missing daughter, but whose amnesia meant she couldn't provide personal details that only real Sophia would. Remember, you have your mother's eyes, Richard Whitmore said at 3:17 p.m. as he stood 3 feet from Sophia, his voice breaking with emotion that 23 years of searching hadn't prepared him to manage when confronting possibility that woman before him might actually be daughter he'd believed was probably dead despite maintaining public hope. Catherine, your mother, died 8 years after you were taken. Cancer. She never stopped believing you were alive somewhere, even when police gave up searching. At 62, Richard Whitmore possessed the kind of exhausted hope that characterized parents of missing children whose decades of disappointment hadn't eliminated desperate belief that next lead might be the one that brought their child home. Making his careful approach to Sophia reveal both yearning for reunion and terror that false hope would prove more devastating than continued uncertainty about daughter's fate. "I don't remember her," Sophia replied, tears streaming down her face as she processed that mother who'd searched for her was dead. "I don't remember you. I don't remember being 3 years old in San Francisco Park. All I remember is waking up on highway in rain with no idea who I was, and this man, Darius, finding me and protecting me when he didn't have to. Mr. Cole, my attorneys tell me you've been housing my daughter for 11 days without contacting authorities despite knowing her identity," Richard said, his tone carrying both gratitude and concern about circumstances of Sophia's recovery. "Why did you wait so long to contact me? Why not immediately report her recovery to police, who've been investigating her disappearance for 23 years? Because your daughter was terrified of hospitals and police for reasons she couldn't articulate, and my detective instinct suggested her fear was trauma-based warning rather than paranoid delusion," Darius replied, defending choices that Richard's security team had been investigating since Darius's initial contact. "I prioritized her immediate safety over proper procedure, and I'm prepared to accept legal consequences of that choice if harboring her constituted crime. But I'm not apologetic about protecting vulnerable person whose instincts warned that official systems might expose her to continued danger." At 38, Darius possessed defensive posture that characterized people whose good intentions were being evaluated through legal framework that treated procedural violations as more significant than positive outcomes those violations had achieved, making his justification for hiding Sophia sound simultaneously reasonable and problematic, depending on whether Richard's priority was reunion with daughter or punishment of man who delayed official notification. "My security team has been investigating your background, Mr. Cole," Richard said, revealing that Billionaire's response to Darius's contact had included comprehensive examination of former detectives' history. "You were excellent police detective until 2017 case where 5-year-old kidnapping victim died while you were lead investigator. You left police work shortly afterward, became construction worker, got divorced, and apparently never fully processed failure that ended your career. My psychologist consultants suggest your protection of Sophia represents redemption attempt for child you failed to save." "Your psychologist consultants are probably right," Darius admitted, "but that doesn't make my help less valuable or Sophia less deserving of protection that motivated it. I saved your daughter because I couldn't save Emma Richardson 8 years ago, and if that makes my motivation complicated, it doesn't change the fact that Sophia needed someone to prioritize her safety over bureaucratic procedure when her trauma made official systems dangerous." As billionaire and construction worker negotiated complicated dynamic, where gratitude for Sophia's recovery mixed with suspicion about Darius's motivations and methods, Sophia herself was forming alliance with Richard's daughter from his second marriage, half-sister named Claire, who was 28 years old, and whose existence Sophia hadn't known about despite Claire having grown up hearing about disappeared older sister who'd been her father's obsession throughout Claire's entire childhood. "I spent my whole life competing with Ghost," Claire told Sophia during private conversation at 5:47 p.m. after initial family meeting had concluded. Every birthday, every achievement, every milestone was shadowed by Dad's grief about you. Part of me resented sister I'd never met for consuming attention that should have been mine, and part of me desperately wanted you to be found so Dad could finally move forward from trauma that defined our entire family. At 28, Claire Whitmore possessed complicated feelings about Sophia's recovery that mixed genuine happiness about sister's survival with resentment about attention the disappeared sibling had commanded, despite being absent for 23 years. Creating family dynamic where Sophia's return would require navigating Claire's established relationship with father, whose emotional availability had been limited by obsessive search for daughter who'd been taken before Claire was born. "I'm sorry that my disappearance affected your childhood," Sophia replied, processing that her absence had created trauma for family members she didn't remember. "I don't remember being your sister. And I don't remember having father who searched for me. But I'm trying to understand what my kidnapping cost everyone beyond just what it cost me." Over following days, alliance formed between Darius, Sophia, Richard and Claire as they navigated complicated process of family reunification while simultaneously investigating Sophia's captivity, who had taken her, how she'd been held for 23 years, why she'd been able to escape when she did, and what legal and safety measures were necessary to prevent recapture while prosecuting whoever had stolen 23 years of her life. DNA testing confirms that Sophia is definitely your biological daughter, Richard's attorney reported during strategy meeting. Facial recognition software provides 99.7% match, and birthmark positioning is identical to photographs from 2002. There's no doubt about identity, which means we can proceed with criminal investigation into her abduction and captivity. But investigation requires Sophia providing details about her captivity that her amnesia prevents her from accessing, Darius noted, his detective experience identifying obstacle that DNA confirmation didn't resolve. Until her memories return, we can't identify her captor or location where she was held, which means whoever took her remains free and potentially dangerous to Sophia if they locate her before we locate them. My security team is establishing protective protocols, including 24/7 bodyguards, secure housing, and monitoring of any attempts to locate Sophia through digital or physical surveillance, Richard explained, presenting resources that Billionaire wealth provided. But Mr. Cole raises valid point. Until Sophia's memories return, we're investigating crime with victim who can't identify perpetrator, which makes building case extremely difficult despite having recovered victim who police assumed was deceased. As alliance strengthened through shared commitment to Sophia's safety and justice for crimes committed against her, all participants understood that family reunification was complicated by amnesia that prevented Sophia from remembering people she was supposed to love, and by trauma that made her fear systems designed to protect her while trusting stranger who'd found her on highway and violated proper procedure to prioritize her welfare. "Darius, I want to hire you as Sophia's personal security consultant," Richard proposed during private conversation. "Not because you have formal credentials, your detective work ended 8 years ago, but because you're the only person my daughter trusts completely, and rebuilding her sense of safety requires keeping you involved, despite my attorney's concerns about liability implications of employing someone who harbored kidnapping victim for 11 days before reporting recovery. Some alliances form not through conventional trust, but through crisis response that reveals character. And sometimes the people most qualified to protect vulnerable individuals are those whose own trauma makes them understand that proper procedure isn't always equivalent to proper care when systems designed to help actually endanger people whose safety depends on someone choosing protection over compliance. The confrontation that would force Sophia Whitmore to remember 23 years of captivity began 17 days after her recovery when forensic psychologist Dr. Helen Park attempted regression therapy designed to access suppressed memories about her kidnapper's identity, creating session where guided recall triggered full memory return, including devastating recognition that doctor who'd been treating her amnesia was same medical professional who'd held her captive since 2002 and who'd been positioning himself as trusted member of her recovery team to monitor whether she remembered enough to expose his crimes. "Sophia, I want you to focus on the last memory before you escaped," Dr. Park said during hypnotherapy session at 2:47 p.m. in Richard Whitmore's secure estate, where Sophia had been living under protection. "You mentioned door being unlocked. Walk me through what you remember about that moment and what you saw when you left the room where you'd been held." At 23, Sophia possessed fragmented memories that therapy had been gradually reconstructing, but full recall of captivity had remained elusive despite 18 days of intensive treatment, creating frustration about inability to identify captor whose prosecution required victim testimony that amnesia prevented her from providing. The door was unlocked because... Sophia's voice caught as memory surfaced with sudden clarity that weeks of therapy hadn't produced. "Because Dr. Carson was showing me how to operate it. He said I was ready for supervised excursions, that 23 years of treatment meant I could handle limited autonomy, that he trusted me not to run away because I had nowhere to go and no one who would believe my story about being held captive when medical records he'd created showed I was willing, patient receiving treatment for condition I'd had since childhood." The recovered memory included devastating detail that made Richard Whitmore surge forward in his chair. Dr. Carson was name that matched Dr. Benjamin Carson, the forensic psychologist who Richard had hired 3 weeks ago to treat Sophia's amnesia and who'd been present in estate for multiple therapy sessions, where he would have heard every detail about investigation and security protocols. "Sophia, describe, Doctor." "Carson," Darius demanded, his detective instinct activating with horror about implications. "What does he look like?" 57, grey hair, glasses, distinguished appearance that makes people trust him immediately, Sophia replied, her recovered memories now flooding back with crushing force. "He took me from Park in 2002 when I was 3. He was my mother's personal physician, had access to our family, knew our routines, was obsessed with my mother Catherine, and believed that if he couldn't have her, he could create perfect daughter using me as blank slate to raise according to his specifications. That's Dr. Benjamin Carson, who's been treating you for 3 weeks, Richard said, his voice carrying horror about recognizing that man he'd trusted with his daughter's care was the same man who'd stolen 23 years of her life. He approached me after news of your recovery broke, offered his expertise in trauma treatment, and I gave him complete access to you because his credentials were impeccable and he seemed genuinely committed to helping you remember. He was monitoring whether I remembered enough to expose him, Sophia realized, her recovered memories making recent weeks recontextualize entirely. Every therapy session, where he asked about my recollections, he was assessing how much danger I posed to him, and when he determined that my memories were returning despite his attempts to reinforce amnesia through subtle manipulation, he would have... The lights went out. Emergency backup generators should have activated immediately, but estate remained dark except for afternoon sunlight filtering through windows, suggesting that power outage wasn't random failure, but rather deliberate disruption of security systems that protected Sophia from exactly the threat that was now manifesting inside supposedly secure location. "Lockdown protocol!" Richard's head of security, Marcus Williams, shouted, his voice cutting through darkness. "Doctor, Carson left estate 18 minutes ago claiming medical emergency, but he must have disabled security systems before departing. Possible armed intrusion in progress." As estate security scrambled to restore power and secure perimeter, while Sophia's recovered memories revealed that her trusted therapist was actually her decades-long captor, Darius made tactical decision based on detective training that construction work hadn't eliminated. Getting Sophia away from compromised location mattered more than following lockdown procedures that assumed estate security measures were functional rather than deliberately sabotaged. "Sophia, we're leaving now," Darius said, grabbing her arm and moving towards service exit that construction workers' practical knowledge of building layouts had identified during his 3 weeks providing personal security. If Carson disabled primary systems, he knows exactly where panic room is and how to breach it. Our best option is evacuating before his team arrives expecting to find you trapped inside secured estate. Mr. Cole, evacuation during lockdown violates security protocols, Williams objected, his training prioritizing established procedures over tactical adaptability. We need to maintain defensive position until backup arrives. Your defensive position assumes enemy doesn't have complete knowledge of your systems, Darius countered, using tone that former detective authority made compelling despite current employment as construction foreman. Carson had 3 weeks of access to security briefings. He knows your protocols better than you do, and he's planned this extraction based on expectation that you'll follow standard defensive procedures. Evacuating with Sophia creates variable he didn't account for. As debate continued about whether evacuation or lockdown provided better protection, sounds of breaching at main entrance confirmed that Carson's team had arrived with tools and knowledge necessary to defeat estate security that should have prevented intrusion, validating Darius's assessment that established protocols had been compromised through Carson's insider access. "Move now," Darius commanded, his authority overriding Williams' objections, as immediate threat made theoretical security planning irrelevant. "Service exit, my truck in backlot, and we're gone before they complete breach." The escape from estate took 4 minutes of running through service corridors that Darius had memorized during his security consulting work, with Sophia and Eli, who'd been visiting during school break, following closely, while sounds of systematic intrusion echoed through building that Carson's team was methodically clearing using military precision that suggested Captor had resources beyond what solo medical professional should possess. "This was always his endgame," Sophia said, once they'd reached Darius's truck, and were driving away from estate at speed that made conversation difficult. "If I remembered and exposed him, he'd recover me using force rather than accepting loss of woman he'd spent 23 years creating according to his specifications. He doesn't see me as victim he kidnapped. He sees me as project he invested decades perfecting, and my escape represented theft of his property rather than liberation of hostage." "Then we need to stop running and start hunting," Darius replied, his detective instinct reasserting itself. "Carson expects you to keep hiding, to keep being protected, to remain passive victim while he actively pursues. But you're not 3-year-old child anymore. You're 23-year-old survivor who remembers everything about his operation, his methodologies, and his vulnerabilities. We know who he is now. That makes him vulnerable instead of you. Some confrontations with captors require victims transforming from passive targets into active pursuers, when recovered memories reveal that staying hidden perpetuates captors' power, while turning hunter becomes path to permanent freedom that protection alone can't provide." 22 months after Dr. Benjamin Carson had been convicted on 47 counts, including kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, medical malpractice, and attempted murder during failed estate extraction that had resulted in shootout with FBI tactical team, Sophia Whitmore stood at community center hosting support group for recovered trafficking and long-term captivity victims, watching presentation about how survival of 2 decades of imprisonment had taught her that family wasn't defined by biology or memory, but rather by who chose to protect you when protection required sacrificing everything else. The support group was funded by Whitmore Foundation, that Richard had established after Sophia's recovery to assist families navigating reunion with long-term missing persons, providing resources that combined psychological support with legal advocacy and security consulting for cases where victims' captors remained at large, or where family reunification revealed complications that joyful reunion narratives typically omitted. I spent 23 years with a man who called himself my father, but who was actually my kidnapper, Sophia said during keynote presentation to 43 survivors and their families. When I was recovered, I had no memory of my biological father, Richard Whitmore, no memory of mother who died searching for me, and no ability to feel connection to family that DNA testing said was mine. What I did have was construction worker named Darius Cole, who'd found me on highway and who protected me when every instinct said involving authorities would endanger me. At 25, Sophia possessed integrated identity that characterized people whose trauma had been processed sufficiently that they could discuss captivity without dissociating, though her recovery had required intensive therapy addressing not just kidnapping, but also complicated feelings about having loved captor who'd presented himself as caring father while systematically preventing her from remembering actual family who'd been desperately searching. Stockholm Syndrome is real, Sophia continued, but so is genuine bond formed with people who protect us during vulnerable moments. Dr. Carson wasn't real father. He was manipulative captor who isolated me from world while claiming to care about my well-being. But Darius wasn't perfect rescuer either. He was flawed man whose protective instinct came from trauma about child he'd failed to save 8 years before finding me. Both relationships were complicated, but only one was based on control, while other was based on choice. Meanwhile, Darius was experiencing his own transformation as consulting work for Whitmore Foundation had evolved into full-time career providing security expertise for families recovering missing persons, combining his detective skills with construction workers' practical knowledge and former captives' insight into victims' needs that conventional security professionals typically missed. Foundation has helped recover 17 long-term missing persons in 22 months, Darius reported during board meeting reviewing program outcomes. 13 were trafficking victims, 3 were parental abduction cases, and 1 was psychiatric patient who'd been institutionalized under false identity. Average captivity duration was 11 years, and reunion success rate has been 82%, which significantly exceeds national average of 34% for cases where victim was missing more than 5 years. At 40, Darius possessed professional satisfaction that construction work had never provided. His return to investigative consulting, revealing that leaving detective work had been necessary response to trauma rather than permanent abandonment of vocation, that his skills and dedication made him suited for when proper support systems prevented single case failure from destroying entire career. The relationship that had developed between Darius and Sophia over 2 years resisted conventional categorization. He wasn't her father figure despite protective role. She wasn't his redemption project despite having been saved by man haunted by previous failure and mutual care. They developed transcended simple gratitude or professional collaboration into complicated bond that included elements of family without conforming to traditional parental or romantic frameworks. People ask me if I consider Darius my second father, Sophia said during interview for documentary about her case. An answer is complicated. Richard Whitmore is my biological father who I've spent 2 years building relationship with, and I love him despite not remembering being his daughter. But Darius is person who protected me when I was most vulnerable, who believed my fear about systems was valid, and who prioritized my safety over proper procedure when those values conflicted. That's not parental relationship. It's alliance between survivors who understand that trauma creates bonds that don't fit conventional categories. As Sophia's interview concluded with reflection about how unconventional families form through crisis rather than through conventional paths, Eli Cole, now 14 years old and significantly more mature than when mysterious woman had first appeared at family breakfast, provided his own perspective about how Sophia's presence had affected childhood, that divorce and father's trauma had already complicated. Having Sophia live with us for those first 11 days changed how I understand family, Eli said during his portion of documentary. She wasn't my sister, wasn't Dad's girlfriend, wasn't just random person he was helping. She was survivor who needed protection. And watching Dad provide that protection taught me more about character than any lecture about doing right thing ever could. Yeah, it was complicated and technically illegal and created problems with Mum's custody arguments, but it was also demonstration that sometimes helping people requires breaking rules when rules don't serve justice. The mature perspective from 14-year-old revealed how Darius's choice to harbor Sophia had created teaching moment about civil disobedience and moral complexity that conventional parenting couldn't have provided, transforming potentially traumatizing situation into formative experience that shaped Eli's understanding of when rules should be followed versus when they should be violated for higher purposes. 3 years after Darius had found Sophia on highway and made decision to protect stranger rather than follow proper procedure, he stood at her university graduation watching her receive degree in social work that trauma and recovery had motivated her to pursue. Her academic achievement representing reclaimed life that kidnapping had stolen, but which prosecution of captor and reunion with family had partially restored. I'm graduating with honors in social work because I want to help other survivors navigate systems that claim to protect them but which trauma teaches them to fear, Sophia said during graduation speech. My recovery was complicated by amnesia that prevented me from identifying captor, by fear of authorities that made proper procedure seem dangerous, and by construction worker who chose protection over compliance when those values conflicted. I'm alive today because Darius Cole prioritized my immediate safety over his legal obligations, and I'm dedicating my career to ensuring that other survivors receive similar prioritization of their welfare over bureaucratic convenience. Some families are created not through biology or legal bonds, but through crisis response that reveals character, and the most meaningful relationships often emerge from moments when strangers choose protection over procedure because vulnerable people's safety matters more than following rules designed to serve systems rather than serve individuals whose trauma makes those systems feel threatening despite their stated protective intent. The end. If you felt that moment when Darius stopped for Sophia in the rain, if you understood why he didn't immediately call the police, if you've ever had to choose between following rules and following your instincts to protect someone, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that like button if this story moved you. Comment below, what time is it? Where are you watching from? Would you have stopped for someone in the road? Would you have taken her to the hospital or respected her fear? Have you ever broken rules to help someone who needed protection? Share this with anyone who needs to understand that family isn't always defined by blood, that protection sometimes requires breaking rules, and that the people we save sometimes end up saving us right back. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next story.